He broke her. She buried him in silence and built herself into something untouchable. And now, 5 years later, fate just sat him down in her exam chair. He came in for a checkup. She's about to find a bullet fragment next to his heart from the night he vanished. The question is, will she save him? Or will she finally let him die? The private wing of St. Jude's Medical Center smelled like money and secrets, not the cheap antiseptic stench of a county hospital. This was different. Cedar wood panels lining the walls, soft recessed lighting that cast everything in a shade of clinical gold, and the faint trace of jasmine from the air filtration system. The kind of place where powerful men came to be quietly fixed without the inconvenience of paperwork, police, or questions they couldn't afford to answer. Ji-Yeon hated it immediately. He sat on the edge of the exam table in a charcoal Brioni suit. His shirt collar was open at the top, exposing the ink that climbed his neck. Hangimoda, loyalty to the end. The Hanja characters were thick and deliberate, the mark of the Shadow Lotus Syndicate burned into his skin 12 years ago when he was 19, and hungry and willing to bleed for something bigger than himself. Now he was 32. The youngest head of the Korean underworld in Los Angeles history. And his hands, steady hands, hands that had signed death warrants and stock certificates with equal calm, were trembling at the knuckle. He pressed them flat against his thighs and breathed through his nose. The dizzy spell had hit him during a territorial meeting in Koreatown, mid-sentence, out in front of 7 men who would eat the slightest sign of weakness like wolves tearing into wounded prey. He hadn't fainted. Ji-Yeon did not faint, but his vision had tunneled to a pinhole and the room had tilted sideways, and when he'd gripped the edge of the conference table, his Lieutenant Park had seen it. Park, loyal, discreet Park, had arranged this visit within the hour. Off the books, off the record, off the grid. Your doctor will be in shortly, sir, the nurse had whispered, eyes lowered. They all lowered their eyes around G. They either feared him or coveted what he was. There was no middle ground. He checked his watch. 4:47 p.m. He had a dinner with the Zhao faction at 8 and a contract dispute with 3 port commissioners at midnight. He did not have time for whatever was wrong with his chest. The door opened. The sound of it was soft, a whisper of air, the subtle click of a latch releasing. But to G's ears, sharpened by years of rooms where sounds meant survival, it landed like a gunshot. He heard heels on the tile, measured, unhurried, the walk of someone who owned whatever room they walked into. And then he heard the voice, directed at a tablet screen, not at him yet, low and precise and entirely unimpressed, 41-year-old male presenting with syncope and arrhythmia, elevated cortisol markers. She stopped. G turned. The world did not slow down. It stopped. Dr. Deborah Carter stood in the doorway in a white coat so crisp it looked like armor. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, sleek bun at the nape of her neck, not a single strand out of place. Eder and her stethoscope draped across her shoulders caught the light like a chain of polished silver. She was more beautiful than he remembered, and he had spent 5 years trying to forget the specific geometry of her face, the particular depth of those dark eyes, the way her jaw set when she was composed but furious. She had clearly mastered furious, because she looked at him now, and she did not gasp. She did not stumble. She did not blink. She just looked at him the way a surgeon looks at something that needs to be cut, with absolute, terrifying precision, and then she looked back at her tablet. "Deep breaths, Mr. G," she said, her voice unwavering, "if you can still manage those." G's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He, who had stared down federal prosecutors and rival syndicate heads with the same flat, dangerous calm, could not produce a single syllable. Deborah. It's Dr. Carter. She crossed the room without missing a step, pulling a blood pressure cuff from the wall mount with practiced ease. Sit straight. Feet flat. How are you? I'm your physician tonight. That's all you need to know about me. She wrapped the cuff around his arm and squeezed the bulb with quiet efficiency, her fingers careful not to touch his skin directly. Clinical. Deliberately clinical. How long have the episodes been occurring? 3 weeks. Frequency? This is the 4th. Her eyes flicked to his face, just for a half second, and something moved behind them. Not warmth, something closer to confirmation of a theory she'd already arrived at on her own. 4 episodes in 3 weeks. Palpitations between them? Yes. Sleep? 4 hours, maybe 5. Appetite? I eat when I'm not working. So never. She noted something on her tablet. Tell me, G, is there anything unusual your body has been carrying that I should know about? Old injuries, for instance? The question was clinical. Her face was clinical. But G heard the edge buried beneath it, sharp as a scalpel, and he held very still. Nothing significant, he said. Dr. Deborah Carter looked at him then, really looked at him, and the temperature in the room dropped 4 degrees. I'll need a full-body scan, she said. We'll start with the chest. Deborah had rehearsed this moment approximately 0 times because she had believed with absolute certainty that it would never happen. Ji-Yeon was not supposed to be alive, not because she had wished him dead, though there had been months, raw and ugly months, where she had stared at the ceiling of her apartment and entertained the possibility, but because men like Ji did not survive long in the life they chose. She had known that even when she loved him, especially when she loved him. He had walked into her world 6 years ago like a controlled detonation, quiet on approach, devastating on impact. She had been a third-year cardiology resident then, fierce and sleep-deprived, and so certain she had armored herself against every distraction the universe could throw at her. And then Park had brought a man with a knife wound to her ER, off the books cash, please don't ask, and the man had sat in the curtained bay with blood soaking through his shirt and looked up at her with eyes the color of deep water and said, in perfect unaccented English, "You have remarkable hands for someone so angry." She had stitched him up and charged him double. He had come back the following week with food from the Korean restaurant 3 blocks from the hospital, left it at the nurse's station with a note that said only, "For the doctor with the remarkable hands." A year and a half of that. A year and a half of carefully constructed walls on her side and careful, unhurried patience on his. Until one night over takeout in his penthouse overlooking Koreatown, she had looked at the ink on his neck and the scar on his jaw and asked very quietly, "How much of what you do am I better off not knowing?" And he had looked at her with those deep-water eyes and said, "All of it." "Then stop," she had told him, "or stop pretending I'm not in it with you." He had kissed her instead of answering, and she had let him. It was because she had already fallen past the point of catching herself, and they both knew it. 18 months of something rare and terrifying and real. And then one Tuesday evening, she'd sat in a diner booth waiting for him for 2 hours while her coffee went cold, and he never came. No call, no message, no note, nothing. Ji-Yeon had dissolved from her life like smoke, and she had spent 6 months looking for the fire before she accepted that she was only burning herself. She had taken the fellowship at Johns Hopkins. She had run. She had built herself back from the scorched ground up, harder, colder, more precise than she'd ever been. She had come back to L.A. 18 months ago as chief of cardiothoracic surgery at St. Jude's because she had decided Los Angeles no longer had the power to hurt her. She had been wrong. It had just been waiting. Now she stood in the imaging suite watching G's scan render on the screen, her arms folded across her chest, her face carefully empty, and she told herself her hands were not shaking. They were shaking. "Get me a high-resolution CT of the thoracic cavity," she said, "now," and clear the suite. The image on the screen was unmistakable. A fragment of metal, micro-shrapnel, jagged and dense, no larger than a thumbnail, lodged 4.2 millimeters from G's pulmonary artery. It had been there long enough to calcify slightly at the edges, long enough to have traveled, fraction by fraction, from wherever it had entered, toward the precise center of his chest. Deborah stared at it for a long time. Then she walked back into the exam room, tablet in hand, and stood in front of G with the kind of stillness that only women who have survived genuine devastation can manage. "Take off your shirt," she said. Something flickered across G's face. Not shame, something adjacent to it, something careful. "Deborah, Dr. Carter. And this is a medical instruction, not a conversation." He held her gaze for a moment that stretched too long. Then he reached for the buttons. What was beneath the Brioni suit was not the body of a man who lived behind a desk. The muscle beneath his skin was the compressed, functional kind, earned, not decorative. And across his left flank, running from his lower ribs toward the back, was a scar that had not been there the last time she had touched this body. A healed entry wound, poorly stitched, de-stitched by someone who knew what they were doing but had done it under pressure, without proper tools in the dark. Deborah looked at the scar, then at the image on her tablet, then at Ji. "When," she said, "old injury, when, Ji?" His jaw tightened. The Hangimoto tattoo pulsed above his collar as his heart rate climbed. She could see it, the faint beat of his pulse at his throat. 5 years ago, he said finally, quietly. The air in the room changed. 5 years. The same night he had vanished from her life. The same night she had sat in that diner booth for 2 hours watching her coffee go cold. He had not abandoned her. He had been bleeding somewhere in the dark while she waited, and the piece of metal that had done it was still inside him, still moving, still trying to finish what it started. "You were shot," she said. Not a question. "A pipe bomb. Under my car." His voice was flat, controlled. Most of the shrapnel was removed. One piece. He paused. "I was told it was dormant, that it would encapsulate and cause no further damage." "Whoever told you that," Deborah said, her voice very soft and very cold, "was either incompetent or lying to you." She turned the tablet toward him. "This piece is 4.2 millimeters from your pulmonary artery. The episodes you've been experiencing, the dizziness, the palpitations, the arrhythmia, they're not stress. The fragment is migrating. Your own heartbeat has been slowly walking it toward the one place in your body that will kill you if it arrives." Ji looked at the scan. Then he looked at her. "How long?" he asked. "Without surgery, weeks, maybe less." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Deborah had ever heard. "So," Ji said at last, his voice carefully measured, "I need you to save my life." "No," Deborah said, "you need surgery. Whether I perform it is a separate question." She walked to the door. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke again. "Deborah." Just her name. Nothing else. But the way he said it, like it was something precious he'd been holding in a closed fist for 5 years, made her stop. "I know what I owe you. I know it can't be repaid. But please understand what happened that night." "Was your choice," she said without turning, "and I made mine. I kept living." She opened the door. "I'll have a surgical plan drawn up within the hour." Sora arrived at St. Jude's at 6:14 p.m. in a black Escalade and a slate-gray dress. She was 30 years old, Korean-American, and had been Ji's most trusted lieutenant for 3 years. She ran the Shadow Lotus's financial operations with a surgical precision that Ji had admired, perhaps too much to notice the other qualities she possessed: the patience of a predator, the stillness of something that had decided exactly when and how it would strike. She walked to the reception desk and produced a document. "Sora Han," she said pleasantly, "I'm here regarding my brother, Ji Min-jun. I'm his medical power of attorney." Behind the desk, the administrator scanned the document. It was flawless, a forged legal document so clean it had watermarks. "Of course, Ms. Han. I'll let his physician know you're here." Sora smiled and stepped away from the desk. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text. "He's confirmed at the location. You have a window." Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. So the way she had been waiting for 3 years, for the moment the throne became available. What neither Ji nor Deborah knew yet was that Sora Han was not reacting to tonight. She had been architecting it. The pipe bomb 5 years ago. The photo left in Ji's car. The kill order placed against a woman named Deborah Carter 18 months before the explosion. None of it had been the rival faction's doing. It had all been Sora, threading the trap one wire at a time, patient as a surgeon herself, waiting for Ji to walk in far enough that he couldn't find his way back out. She had not anticipated Deborah surviving 5 years and becoming someone harder to move than a wall. In the private wing, Deborah's resident intercepted her in the hallway with a look she recognized as someone delivering bad news they didn't fully understand. "Dr. Carter, there's a woman at the desk claiming to be Mr. Ji's next of kin. Medical power of attorney. She's asking to review his file and consult on treatment decisions." Deborah's eyes sharpened. "His next of kin? A Sora Han. She has documentation. Have her wait in the family consultation room." Deborah was already moving back toward Ji's exam suite. And do not release his file to anyone, not a page, not a lab result. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. She pushed through the door and found Ji exactly where she'd left him, buttoned back up, sitting perfectly straight, looking at the door as though he'd known she was coming. There is a woman named Sora Han at the reception desk, Deborah said. She claims to be your sister and your medical power of attorney. Is that true? Ji went very still, the way a knife goes still before it's drawn. No, he said. It is not. Then who is she? Ji was already on his feet, his hand reaching for his phone. Deborah watched his face shift, not into fear, because Ji Min-jun didn't have fear the way other men did. What moved across his face was something colder. The recalculation of a man who has just realized he walked into a trap. She's one of mine, he said. Was one of mine. He looked at Deborah. Deborah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This hospital is no longer safe. This is a hospital, Ji. It is a location that my enemies now know I am in. He was already moving toward the window, scanning the parking structure below. Sora did not come here out of concern. She came here to ensure that whatever is wrong with me doesn't get fixed. The lights died at 6:47 p.m. Not all of them. The emergency generators kicked the surgical suites and ICU back to 40% within seconds. But the private wing went dark for 11 full seconds, and in those 11 seconds, the entire geometry of the building changed. Ji had Deborah's wrist before she could reach the door. Don't. Let go of me. The hallway is compromised. They will have men on the exits. His grip wasn't rough, but it was absolute. I need you to trust me for the next 60 seconds. Just 60 seconds, Deborah. Can you do that? She looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked at his face. And what she saw there was not the man who had abandoned her, but the man who had stitched himself together in the dark and kept moving. She hated that she could still read him. 60 seconds, she said. He pulled her sideways into the supply corridor, a narrow service passage that connected the private wing to the hospital's main medical storage. The emergency lighting here was a faint red, casting everything in the color of urgency. The smell of stored saline and latex filled the air, and beneath it, beneath Ji's expensive cologne, she caught it, the metallic edge of adrenaline, and something older, blood that had already dried in his shirt from where the IV had torn when he'd pulled it. You're bleeding again, I'm aware. Ji, I know where they'll position, he said quietly, studying the layout from memory. Service elevator, east stairwell, and the loading dock. They won't touch the emergency floors, too much staff, too many cameras they can't control. We need to get to the restricted pharmacy lab on sub-level 2. That's a dead end. It has a reinforced door, he said, and it's the last place anyone would look for a cardiothoracic surgeon and a man with no heartbeat. She stared at him. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be accurate. Move. They moved. Deborah Carter had spent years in emergency medicine, had run codes at 3 a.m., had kept her hands steady while people died and lived and died again on her table. She was not a woman who panicked, but navigating the red-lit service corridors of her own hospital with a Korean Mafia boss bleeding through his shirt beside her was a category of situation her Johns Hopkins training had not specifically covered. She kept her breathing even. She watched the corners. She matched his pace. At the intersection before the sub-level stairwell, Ji stopped her with one hand flat against her sternum, gentle, or sudden, definitive, and pressed them both against the wall as two figures in gray maintenance uniforms moved through the corridor 20 feet ahead. They were not moving like maintenance workers. They were moving like men who were looking for something. Ji's hand stayed on her chest, just above her heartbeat. She could feel his pulse against her shoulder, elevated but controlled, a metronome in a storm. The figures passed. He exhaled. She exhaled. Neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Ji, she said. Yes, your hand. Right. He pulled it back. They kept moving. The restricted pharmaceutical lab on sub-level 2 was dark and cold and smelled of acetone and precision. Metal shelving rose floor to ceiling on 3 walls, lined with locked drawers of controlled substances, blood thinners, and emergency cardiac medications. An irony so thick Deborah could have choked on it. She locked the reinforced door behind them and turned to find Ji already cataloging the room, not the drugs, but the space. Exits, angles, sightlines. The reflex of a man who had never in his adult life walked into a room without calculating how to survive it. "Sit down," she said. "You're losing blood. I've lost more. That's a terrible metric." She was already pulling a first aid kit from beneath the counter and guiding him down onto the stool with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Hold still." She cut the sleeve of his shirt away from the IV site and worked in silence, her hands clean and quick. He was quiet in the way of a man who has trained himself not to make sounds that communicate weakness. She could feel the tension in his arm, not from pain, but from restraint. The lab was cold enough that her breath came in faint wisps, and the emergency lighting above them threw everything into a deep amber that made the whole room feel less like a hospital and more like a confession. She could feel him watching her work, not the way a patient watches a doctor, the way a man watches the one person in the room he is terrified of losing. "Why Sora?" she asked, without looking up. "She has been building a case for succession for 3 years. My illness, if it became known, would trigger the covenant. The Shadow Lotus does not tolerate weakness in its head. If I die or if I am incapacitated, the next in command inherits. And Sora is next in command. She arranged to be." His voice was controlled, but Deborah caught the thing beneath it, not anger. Something colder and more personal. Betrayal. The sound came from outside the door. 2 sharp impacts, then silence. Ji was off the stool before Deborah had processed what she'd heard. He picked up an IV stand from the corner, heavy steel, 5 feet long, with the same calm with which another man might pick up an umbrella. He positioned himself against the wall beside the door. Deborah grabbed an emergency oxygen tank from beneath the counter. It weighed 11 pounds and was solid aluminum. She was a surgeon. She understood leverage. Ji looked at her, just looked at her for one unguarded second, and something crossed his face that no one in his organization had ever seen from him. Quiet wonder. The door held. The men outside moved on. In the silence that followed, with the adrenaline still crackling through her veins and her knuckles white around the oxygen tank, Deborah spoke first. "You could have come back," she said. "You could have told me. I'm a grown woman, Ji. I could have made my own choices." His jaw tightened. The oxygen tank was still between them, like a confession neither of them had made yet. "The night of the bomb," he said. "I found something in my car before it detonated. A photo. Of you." It had been placed there deliberately, a message. "The people who sent it wanted me to know that if I did not remove myself from your life, they would remove you from mine. Permanently." The words landed softly. They landed like the last blow in a fight that had already ended. "So you left," she whispered. "I left," he said. "And I had Park remove your name from every Shadow Lotus database, every record, every ledger. I burned you out of my world so completely that the men who threatened you had nothing left to reach for." His voice dropped to something she had never heard from him, raw and honest and exhausted. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you, Deborah. I left because you were the only thing in this entire life they could use to break me. And I refused to let them." What he did not say, what neither of them knew yet, was that the photo in the car had not come from the Zhao faction. It had come from Sora. She had identified Deborah as Ji's singular weakness 18 months before the bomb. She had placed the order herself and sent the image herself, engineering his isolation with the same cold patience she had applied to everything else. She had not just wanted the throne, she had wanted Ji alone, diminished, and unable to remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting. Deborah was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, because Deborah Carter did not come apart in critical situations. That was the entire point of everything she had built herself into. "I need to get you to an operating room," she said. "That fragment has 12 hours, maybe less. If you're under any additional stress," she stopped herself. She looked at him in the amber half-dark of the lab, this man who had carried a piece of the night he left her inside his chest for 5 years, who had bled alone so she wouldn't have to. Then she made the decision the way she made all decisions, with precision and without apology. "Can you walk?" Ji looked at her with the expression of a man who finds the question insulting and understands completely why it was asked. "Yes," he said. "Then let's go," she said. "Because I did not survive 5 years of rebuilding myself to watch you die in my hospital." And Ji, for the first time in longer than he could remember, did not argue. OR Suite 3 was the most secured room on the surgical floor. Reinforced walls, a separate ventilation system, a door that required 2 keycards, and a biometric scan to open. It had been designed for high-profile cases where patient privacy was non-negotiable. Tonight, it was the only room in St. Jude's Medical Center that Deborah trusted. She had 2 nurses she trusted with her life prepped and masked beside the table. She had the instruments laid out. She had the surgical plan committed to memory with the precision of someone who did not use checklists because she never needed them. What she had not prepared for was the sensation of Ji lying on her table. The anesthesiologist administered the propofol with practiced calm, and Ji's eyes found Deborah's as they began to close. The Hangamoto tattoo was visible above the surgical drape. Loyalty to the end. She made herself look away. Gloves on, instruments ready. "Do I save the monster?" her mind whispered, "or the man?" The answer, the one she'd known since the moment she'd seen that fragment on the CT scan, was that she was not capable of letting him die on her table. Not because of what they had been, because she was Deborah Carter and she did not lose patience. That was the whole point. She made the first incision. 12 minutes into the procedure, Maya, one of her nurses, stepped away from the table to answer a quiet call. She returned 30 seconds later and adjusted the IV drip by a fraction. A gesture so small, it dissolved into the rhythm of the room. But 2 minutes later, the monitoring equipment told a different story. Ji's vitals were dropping faster than surgical sedation explained, his pressure falling in a pattern that had nothing to do with the surgery and everything to do with the compound Maya had just introduced into his line. "His pressure is dropping," Kwan said from the monitoring station, his voice sharp with confusion. "Doctor, his pressure is dropping faster than—" Deborah's eyes snapped to the numbers. She scanned the field, the IV lines, the equipment. Her mind was moving faster than her hands. "What did you add to the line?" she said. Quietly, precisely, to Maya. The room went still. Maya's eyes shifted to the door. 1 second of hesitation that told Deborah everything she needed to know. "Kwan, get her out of my OR now and lock the door behind you." Kwan moved. Maya bolted. Inside the room, Deborah was already compensating, hands moving with the focused monologue of a surgeon who trusts nothing but her own training. The fragment came free at 8:23 p.m., held in forceps, smaller than her thumbnail and heavier than 5 years of silence. She placed it in the surgical tray and kept working. The monitors flatlined at 8:31 p.m. The long, flat, merciless tone cut through the surgical floor like a blade. 30 seconds later, the OR door opened. Sora Han walked in wearing hospital scrubs over her gray dress, a silenced weapon in her right hand, and the expression of someone who has waited years for a moment and is finally tasting it. "A tragic surgical complication," she said. She knew with a calm that was its own kind of violence. She moved toward the table, the gun raised. The Great Lotus, felled not by rivals but by a weak heart, the organization will mourn. Her eyes moved to Deborah, cold and assessing, and the doctor who lost him will be compensated generously for her grief. Deborah stood motionless beside the table, both hands visible, in the posture of a woman who has surrendered. She had not surrendered. Her left hand was behind her hip, fingers already closed around the paddles of the defibrillator unit mounted to the crash cart 3 feet to her left. "You targeted him from inside," Deborah said, steady, buying seconds. "The bomb 5 years ago. That was you." Something shifted in Sora's expression. Pride. The particular vanity of someone who has kept a secret too long and has just been offered the chance to own it. Ji could have been extraordinary, Sora said, if he hadn't kept choosing the wrong things. You, for instance. "Thank you," Deborah said. "That's what I needed." She fired the defibrillator, not at Ji, at Sora. The paddles, pressed against the metal crash cart, sent a surge through the conductive flooring that hit Sora at the knees and dropped her like a switch had been thrown. The gun skittered across the tile. The flatlined man on the table sat up. Ji removed the electrode from his finger with the same calm with which he'd placed it there. He had never been fully under. He had adjusted his breathing and pre-op to reduce the propofol uptake. Cheer, an old survival reflex from years when his enemies had tried to put him down the same way. He had staged the flatline himself, reaching a single finger to the sensor lead and introducing a false reading, baiting Sora into the room so she would walk into exactly what she'd spent 3 years building. He crossed the room to where Sora lay gasping on the tile and crouched beside her. He said nothing for a long moment, just looked at her with those deep-water eyes. 3 years, he said finally, very quietly. I trusted you for 3 years. Sora looked up at him. For the first time since Deborah had seen her, she looked like what she was, a woman who had overplayed her hand and knew it. Park's men came through the door 40 seconds later. They had been in the hospital for the past hour, waiting for exactly this. They had always been waiting. Ji had not walked into a trap tonight. He had walked into one deliberately so he could spring it himself. 6 months passed. The world that had known Ji Min-jun, king of the Shadow Lotus, received news of his death with the mixture of relief and mourning that always accompanies the fall of a mythological figure. There was no body. There never was with men like Ji. The underworld moved on, because it always did, and because Park had managed the transition of power with a quiet competence that kept the worst instincts of the organization in check. Ji himself moved to a house in Silver Lake with no organizational connection, no operational footprint, and a view of the reservoir that at sunrise made the whole city look like something worth protecting. He spent the first month sleeping, actually sleeping, 8 hours, sometimes 9, which was so foreign to his body that it alarmed him briefly before it began to feel like medicine. His chest healed. The scar from the surgery was clean and precise, the mark of an extraordinary surgeon who had performed under extraordinary circumstances. He traced it sometimes in the morning, quietly, like reading a sentence he was still parsing. He had sent Deborah nothing in those 6 months. No messages, no flowers, no anonymous donations. The only thing he left her was the space she had earned. She knew where to find him if she chose to. He had made peace with the possibility that she would not. The call came on a Thursday morning, 6 months and 4 days after the night of the OR. The Carter Cardiac Pavilion is having its public dedication ceremony, said the voice on his phone. No preamble, no softening. Because Deborah Carter had never softened anything in her life, and he had always loved that about her. There's a balcony on the east side of the building. I'll be there at noon. He was there at 11:45. The Los Angeles skyline spread below them like a map of everything they had both survived, the towers of downtown catching the noon light, the haze of the basin rolling toward the ocean, the city humming its perpetual, indifferent song beneath their feet. The pavilion's new glass facade caught the sky and reflected it back, clean and expansive and open. She came through the rooftop access door at noon exactly, lab coat traded for a deep emerald dress that moved against her like the city itself was sighing around her, her hair down for the first time in months, falling in soft waves past her shoulders. She looked like the woman he had fallen for in that curtained ER bay. And she looked like someone that woman had become after surviving something, harder in the places that needed hardness, softer in the places she'd finally allowed. She stopped 6 feet from him and looked at him the way she had looked at every complicated thing in her life. Straight on. You built this for me, she said. Not accusatory, just true. I built it for the patients you'd save, he said. You just happened to be the one saving them. She folded her arms across her chest, the gesture he recognized as the one she used when she was deciding whether to close off or open up. I read the documentation, she said. 3 years. You've been funding this for 3 years. Yes? While I was at Johns Hopkins? Yes? You knew I'd come back to L.A. He held her gaze. I hoped. The city moved below them. Somewhere far away, a siren rose and faded. The kind of ordinary emergency that had nothing to do with either of them. Deborah looked out at the skyline for a long moment, the afternoon light cutting across the sharp planes of her cheekbones, the curve of her jaw, the particular stillness of a woman who has decided something but hasn't said it yet. Then she reached over and pressed 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist. Not as a physician checking vitals, as a woman checking something else entirely. His pulse was steady. She could feel it. "It only beats for one reason," he said quietly. She did not look at him, but she did not pull her hand away. "Your resting rate is still too high," she said. "You need to sleep more, I know, and eat better, I know, and stop carrying things alone." Now she looked at him. The full weight of those dark eyes, direct and unguarded for the first time. "Whatever comes next, you stop carrying it alone. That's not negotiable." Ji looked at the woman who had stitched him with cold hands and warm precision, who had fought beside him in the dark with an oxygen tank and ice in her veins, who had removed a piece of his past from his chest and kept him breathing. The woman who had built herself into something extraordinary out of the wreckage of what he had done, who had come back to the city that had broken her and made it belong to her instead. "Not negotiable," he agreed. She squeezed his wrist once, brief and deliberate, and released his hand. Turned back toward the door. Her emerald dress catching the late afternoon light as she moved, luminous and unhurried. A woman who had earned every inch of the ground beneath her feet. "I have a 2 p.m. surgery," she said. "I know, but you can come for dinner." The smallest pause. "If you want." "Yes," he said, without hesitating. "I want." She walked back through the door. He stayed a moment longer on the balcony, the Los Angeles sun on his face, the Hangamoto tattoo covered by a collar, no gun at his hip, no empire behind him, a dead man to the world that had made him. But standing here, in the light, with the sound of her heels fading down the hallway on the other side of the door, he had never been more alive. He didn't leave because he stopped loving her. He left because she was the only thing they could use to break him. And she didn't save him because she forgave him. She saved him because she was the kind of woman who doesn't let people die just because they deserve to. That's the difference between revenge and power. She chose power. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever loved someone who left to protect you, if you believe that real love doesn't always look like staying, leave a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city below. London, Atlanta, Lagos, Toronto, wherever you are, I want to see you. Hit the like button if Deborah carried this entire story on her back, because she absolutely did. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of the Shadow Lotus saga, because Ji and Deborah's story is far from over. The underworld they thought they left behind, it has a long memory. And it doesn't forget women who defibrillate its lieutenants. See you in the next one.